heavy, metallic thud echoes against the quiet of our driveway. It's the sound of my suitcase hitting the asphalt, but to my ears, it sounds like a final gavel on 20 years of loyalty. I am on my knees, the rough stone biting into my skin. I'm wearing nothing but a damp bath towel, clutching a pile of half-dried clothes to my chest, as if they could somehow shield my dignity. Tears are blurring my vision, but I can still see Carter's shadow looming over me. "You're nothing without me, Aaliyah." He sneers, his voice filled with a terrifying, cold triumph. "No home, no money, you signed it all away." He's right, he didn't just break my heart. He stole my father's legacy, every cent of the inheritance meant for my future. I had spent 2 decades building a life with a man who was actually a ghost, waiting for the right moment to haunt me. Just as the humiliation starts to drown me, the air changes. A sleek obsidian black sedan glides into the frame, its engine humming with a low, predatory power. The back door opens, and a pair of polished shoes hit the pavement. A man steps out, Min Choi. I've seen him in the news. The silent power behind the city's most elite circles. He doesn't look at Carter's red, shouting face, he looks only at me. "Mrs. Langford," he says, his voice a calm blade that cuts through the chaos. "I believe your husband has made a very expensive mistake. Shall we show him exactly how much it's going to cost him?" The pavement felt like ice against my knees, but the coldness in Carter's eyes was worse. For 20 years, I had been the woman behind his success, the one who balanced the books, hosted the dinners, and loved him through every corporate storm. I thought we were building a kingdom together. I didn't realize I was merely furnishing a cell. "Read the fine print, Aaliyah." Carter sneered, tossing a damp folder onto the pile of my scattered clothes. "The trust, the estate, even the patents your father spent his life perfecting, it's all legally mine. You signed the management merger without even looking, didn't you? Your love didn't just blind you, it bankrupted you." The air left my lungs. I remembered that night 6 months ago, the candlelight, the wine, and Carter whispering that he wanted to protect my family's assets from market volatility. I had signed those papers with a heart full of trust, never imagining that my husband was actually a strategic predator, waiting for the ink to dry. How could a man share my bed for 2 decades while planning to make me homeless? As I clutched the white towel around my shivering frame, the sheer injustice of it burned hotter than the shame. He hadn't just stolen my money, he had stolen my history. He was standing in the doorway of the house my father bought, wearing a watch I gifted him, telling me I was a trespasser on my own life. But then the shouting stopped. The neighborhood, usually so loud with the sounds of judgment, went bone silent. A black sedan, darker than the shadows Carter was trying to cast me into, pulled up to the curb. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was this another one of Carter's traps? Or was the universe finally listening to my silent scream for help? What happens when the law says you have nothing, but a stranger arrives claiming you have everything he needs? And more importantly, what was hidden in that folder that Carter was so desperate for me not to actually finish reading? The passenger window of the black sedan slid down with a motorized hiss that sounded like a drawing sword. Carter's face paled, his aggressive stance faltering as the man in the backseat stepped out. He was impeccably tailored, a sharp contrast to the chaos of my life scattered on the driveway. He didn't look at the towels or the tears. He looked at me with a gaze that saw a partner where Carter saw a victim. "Mr. Choi," Carter stammered, his voice losing its predatory edge. This is a private domestic matter. My wife is simply having a difficult transition." Min Choi ignored him entirely. He walked toward me, the heavy silk of his overcoat draped over his arm. Without a word, he placed the expensive fabric around my shivering shoulders, shielding me from the prying eyes of the neighbors and the cruelty of my husband. The scent of sandalwood and cold iron replaced the smell of my own fear. "I don't care for domestic drama," Carter, Min said, his voice a low, melodic threat. "But I do care about the 24% of the Langford holdings that were illegally transferred this morning. Holdings that belong to this woman's father, and by extension, to my current investment interests." I looked up, my breath hitching. How did this man, a stranger from the highest echelons of the city's elite, know the exact percentage Carter had just stolen? More importantly, why was a man known for his ruthless business efficiency standing in my driveway instead of a courtroom? "I don't offer pity, Aaliyah," Min whispered, leaning down so only I could hear. "I offer a mutually beneficial liquidation of a common nuisance. You want your life back. I want the empire he's building on your blood." He extended a hand, strong, steady, and scarred at the knuckles. I realized then that I had 2 choices: stay on my knees in the dirt or take the hand of a man who played a much darker game than Carter ever could. As the car door opened for me, I saw Carter's phone light up with an emergency alert from his bank. What did Minkyu do in the 60 seconds it took to walk from his car to my side? And what was the true price of the contract I was about to sign? The leather of the sedan was cool against my skin, a stark contrast to the burning humiliation I had left on the driveway. As we drove away, I didn't look back at Carter's shrinking figure. I looked at the man beside me. Minkyu Choi remained silent, his profile as sharp and unyielding as a diamond. He didn't offer a shoulder to cry on, and strangely, that was exactly what I needed. Pity would have kept me weak, but his coldness was a mirror, reflecting a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. When we arrived at his estate, the gates didn't just open, they hissed, sealing out the world that had discarded me. I was led to a suite that smelled of cedar and expensive silk. On the bed lay a tailored suit, charcoal gray and razor-sharp, next to a pair of heels that looked more like weapons than footwear. I shed the damp towel, the last remnant of the woman who had been a victim, and stepped into the skin of a strategist. As I looked in the mirror, I realized that the softness Carter had mocked was gone. In its place was a woman who finally understood that in a world of predators, you either sharpen your teeth or get eaten. But the real transformation wasn't the clothes. It was the folder Minkyu placed in my hands over dinner. Your husband thinks he used the law to rob you, he said, his eyes tracking my reaction. But he forgot one thing. Fraud is a stain that never truly dries. How do you reclaim a life when the person you loved has burned all the bridges? And what did my father leave hidden in the foundation of his company that Carter's greedy eyes were too blinded by power to see? You aren't just here for revenge, Aaliyah, Minkyu whispered, his voice like velvet over steel. You're here to take back the throne he's sitting in. But to do that, you have to be willing to strike the first match. I looked down at the documents, and my blood turned to ice. Carter hadn't just stolen the inheritance. He had used my father's name to sign off on a series of offshore accounts that were now under federal investigation. If I didn't act now, I wouldn't just be poor, I would be a criminal. Why was Minkyu showing me this now? And was I being saved? Or was I simply being moved to a much more dangerous chessboard? The offshore accounts stared back at me from the screen, a digital trail of Carter's greed that threatened to bury my father's name in scandal. He thought he had outplayed me, moving the money through layers of shell companies he believed were untraceable. But Carter had spent 20 years underestimating my father's brilliance, and mine. My father was a man of the old guard. He didn't trust digital vaults he couldn't touch, so he had built a fail-safe into the very architecture of our family's corporate ledger. He thinks he's locked the door and thrown away the key. I whispered, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Minkyu leaned in, his presence a silent shadow of anticipation. But he doesn't realize my father built the house. There's a ghost in this ledger, a sequence of microtransactions that only trigger if the primary trustee is changed under duress. I began to type, my pulse steadying as the old, familiar logic of my father's coding language flooded back to me. Carter had seen the inheritance as a prize to be seized, but he never understood it was a living legacy. By attempting to wash the money through those offshore accounts, he had inadvertently tripped a silent alarm. How does a woman who lost everything in a single morning suddenly hold the power to freeze a multi-million-dollar empire with a single keystroke? And if the authorities were already watching these accounts, would my attempt to reclaim the money look like a recovery or a confession of guilt? The back door isn't just a way to see the money. Minkyu, I said, a cold smile finally touching my lips. It's a kill switch. It doesn't just stop the transfers. It mirrors them back to the original source of the fraud. As the progress bar reached 100%, a hidden file suddenly materialized on the screen. A file Carter hadn't just stolen, but one he had been desperately trying to delete for months. My breath hitched as I realized the inheritance wasn't the only thing he was hiding. There was a third name on the ledger, a silent partner Carter feared more than the law. Who had my husband truly been working for all these years? And why was their signature dated 3 days before our wedding? The grand ballroom of the Pier Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk and false smiles, the very air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and corporate greed. This was Carter's victory gala, a celebration of the empire he had built on the ruins of my life. Standing at the entrance, I adjusted the weight of my father's signature sapphire necklace, a piece Carter thought he had sold to a private collector weeks ago. I wasn't the broken woman in a towel anymore. I was a living reminder of everything he had tried to bury. When the double doors opened, the room fell into a suffocating silence. I didn't just walk in, I glided, my hand resting firmly on Minkyu's arm. The shift in the room was physical. Minkayu's presence was a cold front that froze the laughter in people's throats. Across the room, I saw Carter. He was holding a glass of vintage champagne, laughing with a board member, looking every bit the self-made titan. Then, his eyes met mine. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor, with a sound that felt like poetic justice. His face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray as he looked from my polished heels to the man standing beside me. He knew Minkayu's reputation, a man who didn't attend parties unless he was there to collect a debt. How does a man who thought he had erased your existence react when you return? Not as a ghost, but as the partner of the person who holds his entire credit line. And if Carter was so sure he had legally bound me to silence, why were the federal agents at the back of the room suddenly looking at their watches? You look like you've seen a ghost. Carter, I said, my voice carrying through the quiet hall with a chilling clarity. But I'm not here for an apology. I'm here for the audit. As Minkayu leaned in to whisper a greeting that made Carter's knees visibly shake, I noticed a woman in a red dress slipping out the side exit, the same woman whose signature I had found in the hidden ledger. The victory Carter was celebrating was a house of cards, and I had just pulled the bottom one. But as the music resumed, a waiter handed me a note that made my heart stop. It wasn't from Carter, and it wasn't from Minkayu. It was from the SEC. Why were they thanking me for a confession I hadn't yet made? The terror in Carter's eyes was only the beginning. Watching him scramble to save face in a room full of the city's elite was like watching a predator realize he had walked into a steel trap. As the night wore on, the gala became a funeral for his reputation. He tried to ignore me, turning to his most loyal business partner to secure a fresh line of credit. But the man didn't even shake his hand. He simply stepped aside, making a path for Minkayu. The wind has changed, Carter, Minkayu murmured, his voice loud enough for the surrounding investors to hear. And I don't invest in sinking ships. One by one, the allies Carter had spent years grooming began to evaporate. I watched as his phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket. Each vibration, a new notification that another account had been flagged, another asset frozen by the backdoor my father had built. The prideful tilt of his head began to sag. The man who had kicked me out in a towel was now watching his own world turn into a desert. By midnight, his black titanium card was declined for a bottle of champagne. The humiliation was a mirror, reflecting the same helplessness I had felt on the driveway. Only this time, the whole world was watching. How do you survive when the very people who helped you steal a fortune are the first ones to delete your number? And how did Minkayu manage to turn the entire board against Carter in less than 3 hours, without saying a single word about the fraud? It's called the slow bleed, Aaliyah, Minkayu whispered as we watched Carter cornered by 2 bank representatives in the foyer. We don't take it all at once. We let him watch it disappear until he realizes that without your family's name, he is a ghost. But as I watched Carter's desperate face, I felt a vibration in my own clutch. It was a private alert from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Someone had just attempted to move the remaining liquid funds, not into an offshore account, but into a trust under my name that had been closed for 10 years. Who was trying to save me behind the scenes? And why did the transfer require Carter's biometric thumbprint to complete? The gala was thinning out, the air turning cold as the reality of Carter's collapse began to set in. I found myself in the darkened corridor near the conservatory when he cornered me. Gone was the arrogant king of the driveway. His tie was loosened, and his eyes were bloodshot with a desperate, frantic energy. He didn't come at me with threats this time. Instead, he reached for my hand, his voice trembling with a rehearsed softness that used to be my greatest weakness. Aaliyah, please, he whispered, stepping into my personal space. We can fix this. I was stressed. I was pressured. I did it for us. To secure our future. Think of the 20 years we shared. You can't let this man, this stranger, destroy everything we built. Tell Minkayu to stop. Tell the banks it was a misunderstanding. I still love you. I looked at his hand, the same hand that had pointed toward the street while I knelt in a towel, and felt nothing but a profound, hollow silence. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a plea designed to pull on the heartstrings of the woman I used to be. But that woman had died on the asphalt. I realized then that Carter wasn't mourning our marriage. He was mourning his access to my father's wealth. How does a man who spent decades perfecting the art of emotional control react when his favorite puppet finally cuts the strings? And if his love was real, why was his other hand behind his back, frantically trying to delete the history on his encrypted phone before the feds could grab it. "You're right about one thing, Carter," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the heat he expected. "We did spend 20 years together. And in all that time, you never actually learned who I was. I don't speak the language of us anymore. I speak the language of evidence." I stepped back, allowing the light to hit the badge of the agent standing just behind the pillar. I had contacted the National Domestic Violence Hotline and the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force the moment I left Minkayu's estate. I wasn't just taking my money back. I was following the legal roadmap to ensure he could never do this to another soul. As the agents moved in, Carter's face twisted from false love to pure, unadulterated venom. "You think you've won," he hissed. "Check your phone. Aaliyah, that trust transfer wasn't a gift. It was a trap." My heart skipped. I looked at the screen. The alert wasn't a deposit confirmation. It was a notification that a lawsuit had just been filed against me for money laundering. How could he have filed a case against me while standing right in front of me? The mahogany-paneled boardroom was suffocatingly quiet, a stark contrast to the explosive fury of the driveway just days ago. Carter sat across from me, flanked by a phalanx of high-priced lawyers who looked at me like I was a temporary glitch in their billable hours. He had regained his smug composure, leaning back as his lead counsel presented the money laundering lawsuit, a desperate attempt to frame the trust transfer as my criminal act. Carter even managed a pitying smile, as if he were sad to see me fall so far. But Minkayu was standing by the window, his silence more powerful than their shouting. He knew what Carter had forgot. In his haste to kick me out and claim victory, Carter had left his phones Bluetooth connected to the smart home security system. "I wasn't just a wife that morning, I was a witness. You claim these funds were moved under Aaliyah's direction to hide assets," Minkayu said, stepping toward the table. "But the law requires intent, and we have the intent on record." I pulled a sleek tablet from my bag and pressed play. The room filled with Carter's own voice, screeching, raw and full of the venom he'd used to exile me. The recording captured every word. "The trust, the estate, it's all legally mine. You signed the management merger without even looking." Asterisk, it captured the sound of the suitcase hitting the pavement and his boastful admission of the fraud he had committed while I knelt in a towel. How does a legal team defend a man who has caught himself in his own confession of domestic and financial abuse? And why did the lead attorney's face turn ghost white when he realized the recording was being live-streamed directly to the district attorney's office via a secure portal provided by the Justice Department's Victim Advocacy Wing? The good man, mask Carter had worn for 20 years didn't just slip. It shattered. The lawyers scrambled to close their laptops, realizing they were now representing a man who had confessed to a felony on tape. Carter's face twisted as he realized that the trap he set for me had become his own prison. "This audit is over," I said, my voice as calm as the morning tide. "I'm not just taking back my father's money, Carter, I'm taking back the truth." As the authorities entered to finalize the seizure of his remaining assets, Minkayu handed me a final document. It wasn't a bank statement, it was a deed. But as I looked at the address, my breath caught. It wasn't my father's house. It was a property in Seoul that Carter had never mentioned. What was he hiding across the world? And why was my name already listed as the sole owner? The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my father's executive suite, turning the mahogany desk into a sea of amber light. For months, this office had felt like a tomb of lost dreams. But today, the air smelled of fresh parchment and victory. Carter was gone, his assets liquidated by the Federal Trade Commission, and his reputation permanently stained by the very greed he used to cast me out. The legal system, supported by the dedicated advocates at the Victim Witness Assistance Program, had finally dismantled the ironclad cage Carter built for me. I was no longer the woman kneeling in a towel. I was the architect of my own restoration. I looked down at the deed to the property in Seoul, the secret asset Carter had hidden as a fallback. He never expected that the backdoor in the ledger would automatically revert all undisclosed holdings back to the primary heir in the event of a fraud conviction. My father hadn't just left me money, he had left me a shield. How does a woman who lost her home, her trust, and her dignity in a single morning find the courage to not only reclaim her past, but build a future she never dared to imagine? And when the person who helped you rise finally steps into the room, do you see a savior or an equal? The door opened softly, and Minkayu walked in. He wasn't wearing his usual sharp, intimidating suit. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable but warm. He didn't stand behind the desk as a superior. He walked to the window and stood beside me, looking out at the city we had navigated together. "The board has ratified your position as chairwoman," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor. "The contract we signed on that driveway is complete. Aaliyah, you owe me nothing." I looked at his scarred knuckles, then at the strength in his eyes. The rise was complete, but as I handed him a new set of partnership papers, this time written in my own hand, I realized the greatest victory wasn't the money. It was the knowledge that I would never again be blinded by a love that demanded my silence. We stood there, two survivors turned partners, watching the sun rise on a legacy that was finally, truly mine. But as Minkayo turned to leave, he paused at the door. "One more thing," he whispered, "the woman in the red dress. She wasn't Carter's partner. She was working for your father. Why would my father hire someone to help Carter steal from me?" And what was the final message hidden in her witness statement? Aaliyah didn't just survive the driveway, she conquered the boardroom. But the deeper she digs into her father's secrets, the more dangerous the truth becomes. If you believe that justice should always have the last word, hit that like button and subscribe to AfroKorean Grit Stories. We tell the stories of those who were counted out, only to rise higher than ever before. Don't let the shadow of betrayal win. Join our community of storytellers today. Comment "Reborn" below if you're ready for Aaliyah's final transformation.